And welcome back, everybody. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at game number 9 in the match being played between Lirean from China and Nepomniachtchi from Russia. I hope you guys who have been watching on YouTube appreciate my attempt at a pure pronunciation. All right, game number 9. Now we do, of course, have Jan playing with the white pieces here, so let's dive right into the action. So the game starts with the move e4 here from Jan. No surprise thus far. We get e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now this move bishop to b5. Now thus far, pretty standard. We get the classic Ruy Lopez or the Spanish opening. It's been played many times so far in this match. It's been a prominent feature in many of the World Championship match in recent memory. So bishop b5, we get knight to f6 being played by Lirean. A bit of a change here. He chooses to play this variation rather than playing a6 and going into marshals, anti-marshals, and the closed Spanish itself. So by playing knight f6, we get the classic Berlin defense. Now this was essayed very prominently in the 2000 World Chess Championship match between Garry Kasparov from Russia and Vladimir Kramnik, also from Russia. Now Kasparov at the time was a world champion. He'd been the #1 player for 20 plus years, but Kramnik played this Berlin defense and Garry was unable to break this Berlin defense, or the Berlin wall specifically, and it's the reason that Vladimir Kramnik beat Kasparov and became the world champion. Now as a side note, I studied with the former world champion Garry Kasparov in 2011, and during that time I had access to his database, and during that time of working with Garry, I came across 212 different files for the Berlin defense. Now what this says to me is that Garry became very obsessed, very consumed by this opening. He spent lots and lots of time trying to study it in ChessBase, and he really was never able to come up with a refutation, which is why this opening is still so prominent at the top level today. So the game continues with d3. We get bishop to c5 being played, and now we have this move c3, castles, castles, and d5. Now, as most of you probably will have noticed from some of my recaps from the candidates tournament in 2022, this is the exact line in the Berlin defense that I myself played, with castles followed by d5. Game continues with knight bd2 to guard the pawn on e4. We get pawn takes pawn, and now this move a5. a4 is played by Nepo here. Now you might on first glance think we'll just take the pony and take the free pawn in the center, but if you do play this line after this move rook to e8 attacking the knight, if you move the knight back to f3 for example, after bishop to a6 attacking the rook to e1, black has knight g4 attacking the pawn on f2 twice. You can't move the rook to guard the pawn because then the bishop will simply capture on either e2 or f1. And here if you play the move knight to d4, black has this crushing move queen to h4 attacking both the pawns on h2 and f2 at the same time. So out of nowhere, white is suddenly lost. So therefore Nepo chooses not to play bishop takes knight. Instead he plays this move a4. We get queen to e7, and now this move queen c2. Now once again, if you're a longtime follower of my YouTube channel, you probably have noticed that a certain someone by the name of Hikaru Nakamura has actually done recaps on this exact position, and he's played this position multiple times. Now the game that you're probably most familiar with is the one that I played against Timur Rajbov in the FIDE candidates tournament in June and July of 2022. In that game I played knight to a7, bishop e2, knight to c6, knight b3, and here I played this move bishop a7, and after bishop b5 I ended up in a lot of trouble in that game. More recently, at the end of 2022, I played this move knight to b8 against Wesley So in the Chess Global Championship, and sure enough, Lirean chooses to play this move as well. Now, my live commentary, which I was doing on Kick at the time, I did mention that all 3 knight moves here are considered to be okay. You can go knight b8, you can go knight a7, you can also go knight to d8. All 3 moves are completely playable. So Ding plays knight b8 like a Hikaru. We get rook to e1 being played, rook to d8, and now we get this move h3. Now my game with Wesley So, Wesley played this move knight to f1, and the game would end in a draw. In this game, however, we have h3 being played by Nepo to stop knight to g4 so that black cannot put pressure on the pawn on f2. So thus far, pretty standard. We get h6 being played here. Now one thing that's worth noting, and I learned this in a game that I played against Lenier Dominguez in the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, is that if you're playing this position with the black pieces, you generally don't want to play this move c6, because after white goes bishop to f1 and you play h6 for example, white can now go knight c4, and there's a lot of pressure towards this pawn on e5, and even after you play knight d7, white can play a move like bishop d2 with rook a d1, and it's very, very hard for black to play, primarily because you really want this bishop on e6, but the knight is in the way, and the knight is stuck on d7 guarding the pawn on e5. So what I learned from that game against Dominguez is that generally here, what you do is you sort of play the waiting game. And the reason that you play the waiting game is that if white goes knight c4 here, you can actually play c6, trapping the bishop on b5. And if white goes bishop f1 with the idea of playing knight c4, there's nothing wrong with this. But you can play a simple move like knight to c6 here. And after knight c4, you can even go b6, followed by bishop to a6. And black, once again, should be completely fine. Now, it's worth noting the main difference here is that your knight ends up on c6 in this position, which is why you do not want to kick the bishop out of b5, because if you kick the bishop, then you no longer have the square available for the knight to guard the pawn, and then the knights getting to c4 and f3 are very, very dangerous. So in this position, we get knight to f1 being played by Nepo, and now we get this move c6. Now here, of course, the situation is completely different, because now with the knight on f1, it can no longer go to the c4 square and put pressure on the pawn on e5. Game continues with bishop c4. We get knight to a6 being played here by Ding. Now this is an interesting move. I am familiar with this idea of going knight a6 to jump to c5 later on, but I do recall that the computer generally prefers putting the knight on d7. At any rate, we get knight a6. Nepo plays knight g3. Now their idea is like knight f5 potentially, so say you play like move like knight e8, knight to f5. If you take the knight and white takes back, suddenly it's very hard to guard this pawn on e5. If you play a move like bishop d6, white can even go bishop f4, and you actually can't guard the pawn anymore. You can't push f6 because then your king would be captured, and if you take the bishop, you simply lose the queen here, followed by knight e5, and white is simply winning the game. So in this position, after knight g3, Ding plays queen c7, trying to avoid the tempo where the knight attacks the queen, but additionally he wants to retreat his bishop back to f8. Game continues with bishop a2. We get this move b5 being played here. Now I don't dislike b5 specifically, but I do think bishop to f8 here right away with the idea of putting your knight on c5 is actually quite good. And one thing you'll notice is it's almost like a mirror in a sense, where in the other variation, if we go back to this position earlier, let me find the exact position. You have this position. You'll notice here white's knights are very strong on c4 and f3, attacking the pawn on e5. But if we get back to this position after say a move like bishop d2 and knight c5, suddenly you'll notice the same thing. White has a pawn on c3, but black suddenly has the knights on f6 and c5, which are attacking the pawn, and the bishop on f8 simply guards the knight as well as the pawns on g7 and h6. So we get b5 being played instead. Now this move is an aggressive move here. It's not necessarily a bad move, but in a sense I feel like this is a move to try to bait Nepo into going all in for an attack. So after we get b5, Nepo plays queen to e2, attacking the pawn on b5. Ding plays rook b8 here. Now this is apparently a mistake. This, I would say, is the first really critical position of the game. Once again, Ding should have played bishop to f8, retreating the bishop and guarding the king side a little bit. But more importantly, while you are sacrificing a pawn on b5, after this move knight c5 is played here, suddenly there are some very big threats. If white plays a move like bishop to e3, developing the bishop, very logical move. After bishop a6, your queen is simply getting trapped here on b5, and you're going to lose the game. Additionally, if you move the queen back to e2, for example, black can suddenly play a move like bishop to a6 here, and after bishop c4 and bishop b7, it's very, very difficult to guard this pawn on e4. If you play a move like knight to d2, trying to overprotect after a4 is played here, you're kind of paralyzed. You can't really push this pawn because of en passant. You can't move either of the knights because then you're going to lose this pawn in the center of the board. Also can't really move this bishop either, so all your pieces are kind of simply glued here. They're stuck, and you can't really do anything. And so in this position, black is already potentially a little bit better. Now that being said, of course, it's not an obvious move or easy to find, but I do feel like Ding should have played this, because when he plays rook b8, now Nepo plays knight to h4 here, and the position starts to get very, very scary for a couple of reasons. First of all, it gets scary in the situation because now white has a very clear-cut plan. Put a knight on f5. And as we learned from Garry Kasparov, and I think he said this many times, there's a famous quote where Gary says a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn. And so after we get knight to h4 here, suddenly you're very worried about what's going on, because the knight's going to f5. But additionally, you look at these pieces here, they really aren't doing a whole lot. The knight on a6 is not doing a lot. Bishop on c5, I guess temporarily there's some threats towards the pawn on f2. Bishop on c8, not doing much. Queen not doing much. Rook not doing much. So you have this box of these 5 pieces here that aren't really very active, whereas white has an obvious plan, which is after bishop to f8 is played, you go queen f3. Let's just say black plays a random move like bishop b7. You can go bishop takes pawn on h6. If you take the bishop, you lose the knight, and this is GG simply because now these knights are jumping all over the place here. The knights are getting in, there's a pin, there's queen h8 checkmate, and it's a total disaster for black. So in this position, Ding has to take. Now the reason that I felt the bishop f8 right away was more important was if we go back here after knight h4, bishop f8, knight h4, black can go knight c5, and after queen to f3 there's knight to d3, and black is just in time to fork the bishop and the rook. And after rook d1, knight takes c1, without a dark square bishop targeting the pawn on h6, there's simply no serious attack. So when you get this position after rook b8, you'll notice that here if you play knight c5, white is just in time with bishop takes h6, because now if you go knight d3 you're one move too late, and white can simply play rook to d1, and white is completely winning here. One sample line is knight takes pawn, takes, now move like bishop to g5. Let's actually, bishop g5 is not right. Knight h5 is actually the right move here. You play knight h5, so if black takes, there's queen takes f7 check, king to h7. Here you go queen g6 check, can't retreat back to g8, and the knight guards the queen. And after king to h8, bishop takes g7, it's checkmate in 2. If you take with the knight, queen h6 is mate, bishop covers the g8 square. If you take with the bishop, I take the knight, you block, I take, and once again your king is stuck in the corner of the board. So it's very, very scary here after a move like knight to h5, and black is already close to loss. Maybe you can play bishop e6, but after takes, bishop g5, bishop e7 to break the pin. White can now go knight g6, and with these knights on h5 and g6, this pin and this queen on f3, black is completely lost here. So in this position, b takes a4 is played by Ding. Try to do something on the queen side. Remember, Ding has played rook b8, so to try and justify this move, he grabs the pawn on the edge of the board, and he hopes to create the kebab by playing rook takes pawn on b2 down the road. Nepo plays bishop takes h6 with no hesitation, understanding that in this position black's pieces are very, very passive here, and with these knights, the queen, and these bishops on these great diagonals, you have to go for it. So we get bishop takes h6. Now we have knight c5 being played here by Ding. We get knight to g6 being played, and this is a very important move here, because what Nepo is trying to do is trying to eliminate this defender, this bishop on f8. Right now in this position, the bishop on f8 is the lone defender of the king side here. It guards this pawn on g7. If you could magically say put this bishop on d6, all of a sudden even these ideas with sacking the bishop and going knight f5 become very scary, with ideas like queen g3 and queen g7. So Nepo plays knight g6, and the idea here is that the pawn is pinned because you have the bishop on a2, and this is the one defender and you want to remove it. Now, one of the former world chess champions, Emanuel Lasker, I don't know if this was an exact quote that was attributed to him, but one of the things that he understood was generally when your opponent is trying to attack you, if you can defend the attack with like 1 or 2 pieces and your opponent's like 3 or 4 pieces, generally you're going to have pieces on the other side of the board which can create counter threats versus your opponent's king or his position in general. So after knight g6, we get rook takes b2 played by Ding, creating the kebab. Of course, we get knight takes bishop here, and now we have this move rook takes knight. Black cannot play king takes knight, because now after queen takes knight, you can't capture the queen due to the pin. And when you play g takes h6 here, white can simply go rook a d1, and one sample line is rook takes rook, rook takes rook. If you take the bishop, I go check here, and you have to give up the queen, and then once I take the bishop, it's game over. Additionally, in this position after rook d1, if you play a move like knight to d3, for example, white can simply play a move like bishop to c4. The knight is pinned here because then you lose the rook, and black has no way of guarding the knight. Your king is also under major attack, and white should simply win in a couple of moves. So Ding plays rook takes knight correctly, and now we get this move bishop g5 played rather fast by Nepo. Now there's nothing wrong necessarily with this move per se, but I think playing this move fast was just a misunderstanding. In this position, Nepo probably should have played this move bishop c4. Now again, I'm not going to be super critical, a lot of pressure, very chaotic position, but to play this move without using more than a minute simply is unwarranted. Now the reason bishop c4 is a better move is because now after black plays bishop e6, you can play this nice sacrifice with knight to f5. If black takes the bishop here on h6, you go queen g3 check. King moves, it's simply checkmate. If you block, same thing. If you take the knight, queen g7, game over. And now if black tries to take the bishop on c4 after bishop takes g7 in this position, let's just say black plays knight h7, you can go queen to g3, and you have a very simple threat. If black plays a move like knight takes e4, there's knight h6 checkmate, GG, game over, spaghetti-o, and you really have no effective way of stopping knight h6 mate here without giving up a ton of material. Knight g5 is maybe the only way, but after queen g5, if you play knight takes e4, white can go queen h5 here, threatening mate in 1, and when you play f6, there's queen g6, and it's mate in 1 no matter what you do. If you take the bishop, I take your queen, game over. If you play a move like bishop f7, knight h6 is also checkmate. So in this position, after knight to f5, The best way for Ding to have played would be bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, and queen e7. But after queen g6, knight e8, and a move like bishop to e3, for example, white is significantly better with D's bishops. They're much better than D's knights. And also in the long run, both of these pawns on the a file are very, very weak here. So if you play a move like knight d7 and white takes a pawn, you're going to lose these 2 pawns in an endgame. With the material being even, you'll probably be down 1 if not 2 pawns. And just to illustrate, say you play knight d6 here, white can even go bishop d5, creating the classic wooden shield in the middle of the board, and all roads are going to lead to a defeat with near certainty. So bishop c4 would have been a very good move by Nepo. Instead, he decides to play this move bishop to g5 after about a 30-second think. Game continues with knight to h7, and now we get bishop to c1, attacking the rook. But what you'll notice here is there's a little bit of a transition, which is that in this position, now all of your pieces are not really close to the black king side. Your bishop is on c1. There's no real targets here for it. You can maybe go knight h5 down the road, but with this bishop being passive, nothing to be targeted, black being able to close down this diagonal towards b3 down the road, the attack is somewhat gone. So after bishop c1, we get this move rook b5 played by Ding. Now the computer prefers this move rook c2, but I think this move is a very difficult move to play considering the situation. You're under pressure. The rook feels really loose here, like there might even be bishop b1 simply trapping the rook, and just in general it's very, very hard to play. So we get rook b5 from Ding, and I actually like the concept behind this move because now Nepo plays bishop to a3, and the idea behind bishop a3 is very straightforward. Nepo wants to blockade these pawns so they can't move down the board. Additionally, you create a pin towards the knight on c5, but most importantly, conceptually, if we move down the road to a position like this, you'll notice that right now the knight blunts the bishop on a2. This is a closed diagonal, but you can always reroute the bishop. So for example, say you get something like this, you can reroute it via b1, d3, and c4, and meanwhile the bishop on a3 is completely dominating the knight on b3. So say we get to this position, you'll notice the knight has no jumps. You can't go to c5, bishop covers a square. Can't go to d4, pawn covers a square. Can't go to d2 or c1 because the knight would be captured. And meanwhile, the bishop is also stopping these pawns from moving down the board. So the knight is actually on the wrong side of the board, and the bishop is dominating the knight. And so it's a very, very deep concept that is played here by Nepo, and I actually quite like it. So we get bishop to a3, rook to e8 is played, and now we have this move bishop c4. Now when I was doing my live commentary, a lot of people thought, well, why not just go c4 and win the rook? Rook moves, you win the knight. Rook doesn't move, you capture the rook. So many people thought this was winning, but after c4, black can sack the rook with rook to b4, and now if you take the rook after pawn takes, black suddenly has 2 connected passed pawns. There's an avalanche of pawns going down the board, and as we all know, a priest cannot stop an avalanche. So back to this position, Nepo plays bishop c4, attacking the rook a different way, and the knight is still under attack. And here Ding finds this very creative move, bishop to e6. Now once again, it's a very similar idea where if white takes the rook with the bishop, you're sacking the rook temporarily, but black now has these 3 pawns on the queen side, and they could essentially become an avalanche down the road. Say you play a move like rook d1, knight to a6, and let's just say knight f5. Suddenly after b4, bishop b2, and a3, these pawns are really marching down the board in a hurry, and black is going to win the game. So when you take that into account and you take into account the match situation as well, it's a very, very difficult move to play. Now the computer thinks that white is still potentially better after taking the rook, but with Nepo leading by 1 point, you don't want to play something where you could potentially lose the game, especially with the white pieces. So after bishop e6, we get bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop is played, and now we have this move knight to f5 played by Nepo. Idea to bring in either the bishop or the knight to d6 here, and then try to gobble the pawns on the queen side. c5 is played here by Ding. Excellent move, by the way, because now it closes down the diagonal. Also at this point, black can now put the rook on b3, create the kebab on the 6th rank, and there's a lot of counterplay. So say you try to go knight e3 and create the bastion. After rook b3, knight d5, black can simply play a move like queen c6, guarding the pawn on a4. And if you play a move like bishop c1, even c4 followed by knight c5 and knight d3, and suddenly black is probably a little bit better here. So we get the move queen to e2 being played instead, attacking the rook. Ding plays rook b3, not c4, of course, because then knight d6 will fork the rooks and the pawn. So we get rook b3, queen to c4, and now queen c6 is played. And at this point, Ding has pretty much survived the worst, and now we're going to have a transition into an endgame, which should be relatively straightforward. So we get bishop to c1 being played by Nepo. Now at this point with the closed diagonal, bishop on a3 is very, very passive. So you get bishop c1, knight to f6 is played, and now queen takes a4 played by Nepo. You'd love to play rook takes a4 and keep the game alive at this point, but it really doesn't work. It really isn't working here. because if you do this after rook takes c3 here, attacking the queen, you have to take with the queen. Black takes the rook, and when you play queen takes e5, black has this nice move queen b4, attacking the rook and the pawn at the same time, a classic right triangle, of course, 90 degrees. If you play rook f1, I simply take the pawn, and black has 4 pawns versus 3 in this resulting endgame and should win. So you can't really do that, even though you'd love to keep pieces on the board. So here Nepo decides to play the move queen takes a4, and after we get queen takes a4 being played here, we get queen takes queen, rook takes c3. Temporarily black is up a pawn, but here Nepo finds a very important move, bishop b2. If Nepo were to play rook takes a5, suddenly after knight to d4, black has this nice bastion, and if you trade the knights, black gets connected pawns, a pass pawn that he can push up the board, and black has very serious winning chances here. So Nepo correctly plays this move bishop to b2. We get rook to b3, and now bishop takes e5, and so material is even once again, but you have 4 pawns on the king side versus 2. Both these pawn islands on the queen side are a little bit weak, and black will have to be very careful to not end up in trouble. So Ding plays rook to b4, offering the trade of the rooks. We get rook takes a5, rook takes e4, rooks come off the board, rook to a4 played by Nepo, and now Ding makes a very practical decision to play knight d4. Now knight d2 is the best move here and draws the game after rook to g4 due to this incredible resource of knight to f4. Now again, in a situation with high pressure like this really is not practical, and you don't expect players to find it, but it's worth noting that after rook takes pawn, king to h8 here, suddenly there's no good discovery, there's no fossil that exists here. You take the pawn, I win your bishop, and you can't really move the bishop away because of the check. So the best that white can do here is play bishop takes knight, and after rook to e1, king to h2, knight f1, game will simply end in a repetition here. You can never really dodge the checks with knight f1, knight g3 forever, and it would be a draw. Instead, however, Ding, getting a little bit low on time, feeling the pressure, plays a very practical move, which is knight to d4. Now this does give up a pawn here, and white ends up with a rook knight and 3 pawns versus a rook knight and 2, but at this level this game should be a draw for a couple of reasons. The first reason is when we look at this position after g6 is played, if the knights are traded here and we end up in a situation with a rook and 3 versus a rook and 2, this is a theoretical draw. I would draw this 99 times out of 100 against Magnus Carlsen. Ding and Nepo, of course, this would also be a draw 99 times out of 100, and maybe in a blitz or a bullet game something wonky can happen, but you should never lose. Additionally, if we reach a different situation where we set up a position like this with the knight in 3 versus the knight in 2, this also should be technically drawn, but with best play from both sides. So due to the fact that both of these trades lead to equality, it's a very good practical decision from Ding just to simplify, because he knows that he should be able to draw this without any issues. So we get knight to e3 being played here, king g7, we get rook b4, and now there's a lot of dilly-dallying with knight g3, rook b7, knight f5. Again, even this endgame with the double pawns is still a theoretical draw, so Nepo doesn't trade. He goes knight g4, we get rook e7, rook b5, rook e1, king h2, rook e2, rook b7, knight d6, rook a7, king f8. A lot of dilly-dallying, not a whole lot happening. Nepo just trying to improve his position a little bit and slowly start pushing pawns or moving his king up the board. So you get king g3, f5, king f3, and now we get this move rook e7 by Ding, offering the trade of rooks. Now again, I would say of the endgames, the knight and pawn endgame is trickier to draw than the rook endgame, but nonetheless it should be a draw. So we get rook e8, rooks come off, knight e5 and g5 is played here, and now we get this move h4. Now in this position, I was strongly advocating for king to e3 here at the time, because after king e7 and f4, the way that I looked at this endgame is that in this endgame where we have the 2 pawns, the g and the h pawn versus the f pawn, there probably are better winning chances objectively from a practical standpoint than any other knight and pawn endgame. So I thought this was the way to play. Now here Nepo decided to use a lot of time before playing h4 and going for a different concept. Now the reason that Nepo played h4 here is that after pawn takes pawn and king f4, the endgame that he's aiming for is king to e7, knight g6 check, king f6, and knight takes h4. Now what you'll notice is that the knight and the king are threatening to capture the pawn. Knight can't really move here, and neither can the king. Now the best line here is to play knight e4, f3, and go back and guard the pawn. But after g3, this is almost like a zugzwang here, where black doesn't want to move any pieces. You don't want to move the king because then you yield the g5 square. You don't want to move the knight because then you hang the pawn. But after king e6, king g5, king to e5, f4, for example, if black goes king e6, you have king g6, which is simply winning because the king or the knight have to yield, and you capture the pawn on f5. And so the only drawing line here is to play king to e4, king to g6, and now this very unusual move, knight to b7. So after knight takes f5, there's king f3, king g5, and now you have knight c5 here. And the point being, if white moves the knight, you win this pawn, and then it's an easy draw. So you can't move the knight without losing the g3 pawn. If you go g4, I have knight to e6 check, attacking the king of the pawn, and you'll drop both of these pawns instantly. So this would be a draw. So when we get this position after h4, king to f4, this is Nepo's dream of trying to go king g5. Game continues with h3 instead, which I really like by Ding, because now it splits the pawns here, which also gives black more practical drawing chance. If you can get an endgame like this, just to illustrate the point, where you get this position with the pawns connected, this is going to be winning 99 times out of 100. Whereas when the pawns get split here after g takes h3, say you win this pawn, this exact position is winning, but with the pawns being split here, there are more drawing chances potentially. So we get king to e7, we get knight to c6 check, and now we have this move king to f6 being played by Ding, bringing the king forward. Game continues with knight to d4, putting pressure on the pawn. But unlike the other situation here, you can't really zug your opponent. We get knight to e4, we get f3 attacking the knight. Knight to f2 is played, which is a very important move. Now knight d6 probably is still drawing here after h4 and king g6, but again, it's still, you still want to be completely sure. So he goes knight to f2. Game continues with h4, we get knight to d3 check, king to g3, and now king to g6 is played, and we have this move knight to e6, threatening to go knight f4. So say you can magically play king h7. Let me just illustrate the point, and you get this spot. If you get knight f4, this is a winning king and pawn endgame with a king and 2 pawns versus a king and 1 pawn. So king to f6 is played by Ding. We get knight to f4 being played, knight to b4. Important move here, because basically what black is trying to do in this position is if h5 is ever played, you go king g5, and now the knight can't move without dropping the juicer on the edge of the board. King can't move without dropping the knight potentially, so you have to be very careful. So you don't want to go h5, but at the same time, if you play like knight g2, you'd love to bring the king to the center, but now black will play knight d3 and cut off your king advances to f4 or f2. So here the game continues with king to f2, trying to bring the king around and leave the knight on f4. We get king to e5, king to e3 being played, knight c2 check, king to d2, knight to d4, knight to d3 check, king to f6, and now white finally gets the king to e3, trying to go towards the f4 square. Game continues with knight c2, king f4, we get knight to d4, king to g3, knight to e2. And here the game continues with king to f2, and now we have this move knight to d4 being played here, and now we get knight to f4, we get king to e5, knight to e2 being played by Nepo, knight to e6, king g3, king f6. Now what's happening here is that black is trying to get the king over to stop the h pawn. White is trying to potentially get the king in and or trade some knights. So for example, say you get a position like this where you get the moves like knight d7, king f4, knight b8. If white can get the knight to g3 and the knight in, white will win the game. So the game continues with king g2, we get king g7, king f2, and now Ding very correctly plays this move f4. Now f4 is a very important move here, because in this position, after you get this f4 move, which fixes the pawns on f3 and f4, white can no longer progress. Black simply wants to bring the king to h5 and win the pawn on h4, and white simply can't make progress. The knight on e2 is boxed in by the knight, no jumps to d4, f4, or g3 potentially, so the game ends in a draw soon. We get king g1, king g6, king g2, king h6, and now knight to c1 is played, and we have this move king h5. Worth noting here, if white plays king to h3 after king to h5, there are no more moves that Nepo can play here to try to keep the game going. If you move the king, you lose the pawn. If you move the knight, there's knight to d4 here, and now you lose the pawn on f3, and of course here we would end up with knight versus knight, which is a well-known draw. So here we get this move knight to c1. Now it's also worth noting, after king to h2 here, black cannot play king to h5, because after king h5 and king h3, black is actually in Zugzwang here. If you move the king, I bring my king forward, I win this pawn on f4, and with the 2 pawns, the wide peepos, white should win the game. Additionally, if you move the knight, you lose the pawn on f4. So it's worth noting that in this position, after king h2, king g6, king h3, king h5, white is the one in Zugzwang. White does not want to move the knight because of the d4 square or the king because of the pawn, but if it's black's turn, then black loses the game. So Nepo decides to play knight c1 here, and now we get king to h5, king to h3, knight to d4 is played, attacking the pawn on f3, and after knight to d3, knight takes f3, knight takes f4, the game ends in a draw. After king h6, king g4, knight takes pawn, king takes pawn, white would have an extra knight and be up 3 points of material, but you cannot make a checkmate with a lone knight on the board. So game number 9 in the World Championship match ends in a draw. So what to say? Early on, it looks very promising for Yan out of the opening. Once again, seemed like he was putting pressure on Ding. Ding was able to stabilize, hold the game, found some very good resourceful moves in that middle game when it felt like it was starting to slip away. So he does a great job of saving the game and drawing with the black pieces. Nepo retains his lead by a score of 5-4 as we go into a rest day tomorrow. And then Ding will have white in game number 10. Now, after the leaks yesterday, it's going to be very interesting to see what Ding does with the white pieces. I think that it definitely affects his white repertoire a lot more than his black repertoire, so it's going to be very interesting. But again, we play the game of chess, we see what happens. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this great recap of game number 9 of the World Chess Championship. We'll be back with another recap after game number 10. But once again, make sure to hit that subscribe button below, and we'll be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys. Bye.